All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Hi, I'm Erin McKean. I'm a developer advocate with the San Francisco City team. The San Francisco City team at IBM, we do a lot of these kinds of events, so there's probably a lot of promotional material right in front of you on these tables where you can find out about more events that we do, how to sign up for them. They almost all involve a delicious lunch, so there's that incentive. And today we're going to have a two-part presentation. So I'm going to talk about building an API with Loopback, and then Joyce from Postman is going to show you how you can test that API with Postman, which is awesome. So just to get a little bit of an idea of where people are, how many people have used an API? Yay, yeah, everybody's hands should be up because if you've ever used Google Maps or anything like that, you've used an API whether or not you know it. How many people have built an API in whatever language? Awesome, cool. So this should be very straightforward. But I want to say right at the beginning, I spent many, many years writing reference books, and I also used to play college bowl. So basically what that means is I really enjoy answering questions, like as a hobby, professionally. So if you're confused at any point, you know, stick up your hand, shout out a question. I will be happy to answer it. If I can't answer it at that moment, I will be sticking around after this and we'll answer it then. And if I can't answer it on the spot, I will get your email address and I will send you an answer via email. If it is an unanswerable, say, philosophical question, I will point you to the great thinkers of the Western canon and you can figure it out for yourself. Anyway, so we're going to build an API today. And perhaps this has gotten stuck in some way. Let's see. Hey, there we go. So I think even if you're doing a demo, anything that you build should have a goal and a purpose. And so I want to build an API, and I told you I love to answer questions, to go on Jeopardy. That will help me go on Jeopardy. That will help me beat IBM's Watson, because I'm a little bit competitive, even though this is not an option really, and win money. So how could I do all this with an API? In order to do that, I need data. An API without data, without something behind it, is just kind of an empty pipe. It's not really very useful. So I need the API itself. I need the data. And I need something to make the data with, to hold the data, and I need something to help me build the API. I could build an API, you know, quote unquote, from scratch without using a framework or any kind of helper, but honestly, life is too short. And also, I think that frameworks in general help you out a lot as a developer because they let you profit and learn from all the mistakes that other people have made. If I'm going to make mistakes, I want them to be brand new, shiny, unique mistakes. I just don't want to keep making the mistakes that other people have made. So given this kind of help, it is pretty easy to make an API. It's not quite so easy to go on Jeopardy. So Loopback is a tool, and it helps you rapidly generate RESTful APIs using Node. It is open source. It is completely free to use. It is maintained by IBM, but you don't have to pay a single dime to use Loopback. It's based on Express. How many people have used Express as a framework for building web pages? Yeah, so if you're familiar with Express, the guts of Loopback are very straightforward. And you can deploy an app that you've created with Loopback anywhere you can deploy a Node app because it is essentially a Node application. And I think that the biggest reason to use Loopback is that it makes development very, very fast. And I'm not just going to stand up here and say that. I'm going to actually show you how fast it is to make an API with Loopback. And this is kind of how Loopback works. You tell Loopback about your data. You give it a model or a schema that says, what does your data look like? And you tell Loopback where your data lives, what kind of database. And then Loopback automatically creates a full set of credit endpoints for you. And that's it. I also like to anthropomorphize things, so I'm going to talk about Loopback a little bit like it's a very friendly, helpful person. But there is no AI involved. Loopback is not sentient. It is just a framework. So when I'm trying to talk to people about what Loopback is, I often like to use the metaphor that Loopback is like cake mix for APIs. So basically, you add your database, just like you add eggs to a box of cake mix, and you stir it, and all of a sudden you have a delicious API. How many of you like to eat cake? I like to eat cake. How many of you like to make cake just as much as you like to eat cake? A couple of you like to be bakers, but the majority of people vastly prefer to eat cake more than they like to bake cake. And I think the same is true with APIs. More people like to consume and use APIs in their programs than like to actually create the APIs themselves. So, but just like cake mix, just because you're using something out of a box doesn't mean that you can't make a very fancy cake. And just like with cake mix, Loopback lets you extend, expand, customize. Basically, you can tweak Loopback applications to your heart's content, and it'll still let you make your cake or your API faster. So I'm going to show you a semi-real-world, goal-driven application that demonstrates how fast making this particular kind of cake is. So we're going to create a Loopback application. I'm going to export an OAI/Swagger definition and then hand that over to Joyce, who's going to show how to use that to create tests. How many people have used what the API description framework formerly known as Swagger? All right, a couple folks. It's now called the Open API spec, and it is basically a way to describe your APIs in a consistent, standard manner. That's because it is a standard. And it lets both people and computers learn about an API well enough to do automated things with it. And the use case for OpenAPI that most people are familiar with is that it helps you generate documentation very quickly for an API that has this spec. And I'll show you what that documentation looks like when we create our Loopback app. But once you see it, you'll say, oh yeah, I've seen that before. And that's driven by the OpenAPI spec. But there's a lot of other stuff that you could build given an OpenAPI spec. And the reason to create this kind of spec for your API is that once you have one, it's kind of like having a handle for a bucket. Sure, you can carry anything in a bucket without a handle. It's just awkward. But once you put a handle on that bucket, you can carry more buckets. Once you have a handle on your API, you can do all sorts of things with your API that would be laborious or time-consuming or awkward to do without it. And I hope that'll be a little bit clearer in a while. But OpenAPI specs mostly look like this. They look like YAML. You can also have them be in JSON if you want. And it just describes your API. That's why it's called an API description. And once you have this description, you can do various automated things with it. Loopback today exports OAI Swagger v2. v3 did come out a few months ago. The tooling is still catching up. The next version of Loopback, which is still a little bit a ways away, it's currently an alpha release, will support OAI 3. There are lots of online tools that will help you convert from 2 to 3. That part of the tooling is already there, since that's kind of the first step for a lot of people. But you shouldn't let it hold you back that Loopback is still using v2 because it's very easy to go from v2 to v3. If you're thinking about starting using OAI today, I would go ahead and start with 3 and then use a down converter to take it to 2 for the tools that haven't gone up to 3 yet. It's very straightforward. So, if you want to follow along, these are the things that you should have installed, but there's no need necessarily to follow along. It should be very clear just by watching it. And I just want to talk a little bit about the data that I'll be using for this API. So, some dude on Reddit scraped over 200,000 Jeopardy questions and converted them into JSON. And I have never, ever been as grateful to a dude on Reddit as to that dude. And so there's a lot of data. And the great thing about this data is it's also very simple. It's not very nested, it's nice and flat, and it's very straightforward. Like, it's easy to human read this data and say, oh, I know what's going on. I found out about this data set not by spending a lot of time on Reddit, I promise you. There is a tiny letter called Data is Plural, and every week, the guy who sends it out, his name is Jeremy, I think, he finds 4 or 5 public data sets that you can just download and play with. It's everything from like Crime Stop data to bioscience data to language data, and kind of weird, cool one-off data sets like this. So I highly recommend subscribing. If you like to play with weird data, and who doesn't, I highly recommend subscribing to it. If you just Google tiny letter data is plural, you should find it. It's the first link. And it's really fun. All right. So let's just see how this works, huh? So I'm going to swap over. Let's get a terminal window. It's not the terminal window I want. Sorry, this is always the most awkward part. Oh, here it is. There we go. And let's make this nice and big. Nobody ever tells you that the #1 skill you need as a developer advocate is to be able to type while looking over your shoulder in the other direction. All right. Is that big enough for folks in the back? Make it a little bit bigger? All right. A little bit bigger? Okay. So I passed over the setup screen pretty quickly, but one of the setup steps was to have Node installed, and you can see because I have blinged out my command line there that I have Node installed, and I'm using 8.9.1. I use the Z shell, the OMyZHS shell, and you can do a lot of cool things with your command line there. The other thing that I said you needed as a prereq was to have the Loopback CLI installed, so I have already done that. And so now I just want to create a Loopback app because I have the CLI. So I just type Loopback app. And it'll ask me what the name of my application is. And let's call this Loopback Postman. And I want to keep it in the directory of the same name. And there are 2 versions of Loopback that are available to you through the CLI right now. I'm going to use the current version because I don't have any requirements that would need me to use the backwards compatible 2x version. And the 4x version is, as I mentioned earlier, still in alpha, so it's not available through the command line. And I'm just going to create an empty server because I don't really want to do any user auths for this API. I feel like I'm going to be the person using it, so. And so now what it's doing is the friendly wombats at NPM are installing a bunch of stuff for us. I'll make this a little bit smaller and move it up a bit. And it's all done. So this right here is actually the trickiest step when using the Loopback CLI. Almost everybody forgets to change into their brand new directory. So now that we've got that, let's go back to the top. Let's see what was created for us. So created a bunch of directories, a package JSON. We'll look at these a little bit more. So I said before that there were 2 things that you had to bring to your Loopback app so that you could make an API. And one was the data, and one was the model. And the next thing to do, because the model depends on knowing where the data lives, is to tell Loopback where your data lives, to give it a data source. And you do that through the command line just by doing this. So I'm going to use Mongo, which I have running. Now, Loopback has connectors for just about every database that you can think of, including, for some reason, all these IBM databases. But, as you can see, Cassandra, Redis, Mongo, MySQL, Postgres, Oracle, and so forth. And some of these connectors are written and maintained by people inside IBM, and some of these are community connectors. Like, for example, the Elasticsearch connector is a community connector, and it is kick-ass. It's really cool. So, but all my data lives in Mongo, so I'm going to use the Mongo connector. And I'm using Mongo locally, so I'm going to use a local connection string. And I do this enough that I have a macro that expands to the local connection string. I use a program called Text Expander. Has anybody heard of Text Expander? If you want to continue to type well into your 80s or 90s, the way I would like to continue to type well into my 80s or 90s, I highly recommend getting something like Text Expander, because you can think about the things that you type over and over again, and then make little shortcuts for them. And if I had to type this string every day of my life for the next 25 years, I would be a very miserable human being. So macros are the way to go. And since I'm using a connection string here, I don't have to individually specify the host, the port, the user, the password, and so forth because it's in the connection string. And because Loopback installs each database connector separately, so you don't install the Redis connector if your API is not backed by Redis. You just install the connector for what you want. So we go back to npm and install the connector. All right, so now we have the scaffolding of the app with Loopback app. Now we have the data source with Loopback data source. The next thing is the model. And extra bonus points if you guess what the command is to add a model. So I'm going to call this Jeopardy question. If you're using Mongo, it's important to make sure that the name of your model and the name of your Mongo collection are the same, because that's how Loopback connects the one to the other. If you run into weird problems where Loopback says, oh, I can't find your data, go back and check that your model name is the same as your collection name. So this is our model name. And we're going to connect it to that data source that we created earlier. I'm going to use a persisted model. Even though I'm not intending to save anything to this data set, I'd like to have the option. I'm going to expose it via the REST API because that's the whole point. It doesn't need a custom plural. And I'm going to save it in the common folder because some person braver than I am might want to write a front-end client for this API. I don't like to write front-end code. Browsers are terrifying. But if you want to use that model with your front-end code, save it in the common folder. Otherwise, you can just save it in server. All right, so now we need property names. So the data schema that we showed earlier, they had a bunch of properties, but I'm only going to use a few for this example. And obviously, Jeopardy questions have questions, and they're strings, and they're required, no default value. And they also have answers, which are unsurprisingly also strings and also required, no default. And I'll just add one more property. They have categories, which are strings, but are not required, no default value. And once you're done entering properties, you just hit return again. So at this point, if the demo gods have smiled upon me, we now have a full working API. And let's see. All right, well, that's one good sign. We have a no error messages. So I did a dry run of this earlier today, so I'm going to hit refresh, and that LL dry should change to LB Postman because this is the name of the application that we gave. All right. So we know at least that much is working. So these are all the endpoints that are automatically or magically generated for you by Loopback. So you can see you've got all the standard endpoints. And this documentation, which is interactive, as I'll show you in a minute, is it's a Swagger UI. It's driven by the OAI description that Loopback also generates for you when you create an API with Loopback. So let's see if it works. Let's find, find one, which is already open. So let's just find one question, because remember we've got 200,000, and we don't want to find all, because this will just chug and die. And hey, we've got one. Now, find one for a Mongo backend always finds the first one in the collection. So if we hit this 100 times, it will always find this first one, which is not all that useful if you're trying to study different questions so that you can win on Jeopardy, because you're going to end up knowing a lot about Copernicus, or the same thing about Copernicus a lot, but you've got 218,000 plus other questions in the data set that you would probably want to be, exposed to. So let's see how we can add a custom endpoint to our Loopback let's add a custom endpoint so that we can get a random question. So I'm just going to open this up in Sublime. Pull this over here. Don't worry, I'll make this pretty big here in a second. So let's just walk through what scaffolding, what the app is actually built for us. We've got this client folder. We've got this common folder. And here are all the properties that we typed in. And this is just a file. If you want to add more properties down the road, you don't have to go back to the command line. You can just edit your JSON right here. So if I wanted to add a new property, say date, I could just type date, have it be of type date, and be on my way, and it would then be accessible to the API. Your server code lives here, and here's where your data sources live, in a datasources.json file. So if you need to change this down the road, again, just a flat file, you can edit. Don't have to go back to the command line. Loopback is also kind of 12-factor app compliant. So if you want to keep your environment variables as you should in your environment and not in your code, you can add another data sources file that says datasources.production.json and have in that file, instead of this URL, you could have an environment variable, you know, like process.env.productionmongo. And then it could pull that from your environment, and when you deploy to production, you're good to go. And it connects to the production database instead of your test database. So if you haven't read up a little bit about 12-factor apps and keeping your secrets separate from your code, I highly recommend it. It's very interesting, and it makes a lot of sense. So I just want to go very quickly to show you how to customize your Loopback application. So you can build any kind of endpoint you want. You can put any kind of custom code inside your Loopback app, and you do it all in this jeopardyquestion.js file. And if you had several different models, each one of them would have a separate JSON and a separate JS file. So another thing I like to use is a clipboard manager. Does everybody here use a clipboard manager? Oh man. Okay. Again, if you want to type for the rest of your life, a clipboard manager, what it does is it saves the last, say, 100 things that you copy-pasted, and then you can choose from them and paste them again. So you don't have to, you can reduce the amount of times you have to copy to infinitesimal, but you can paste as much as you want. So I copied earlier some code here, and I'm going to copy another one. And sorry, this is not indented well, it's pretty ugly, but I didn't have to type all this stuff, which is a good thing. And let's add the function. So I use a clipboard manager called Copy and Paste, and I did actually pay for it. It's paid software. I like to pay people to write software because then someday people might pay me to write software. It's like a whole economy thing. But so, let me make this just a tiny bit smaller. So what I've just done here is added a couple functions. One for categories and one for random. And what the categories does is it, with Loopback, if you're connected to a particular database, you can drop down and use that database's syntax directly. And so Mongo has this really cool method that you can use where you can get collection distinct. And what that means is it will return every unique value for that property of every object in that collection. So instead of like getting them all and then uniquing them yourself, Mongo does it for you, which I think is really great. Like if a database is going to do the work for me, I want to let the database do the work for me. And the same thing with random. The collection aggregate method, what it lets you do is it lets you take a sample from the collection of size 1, and it handles the randomization for you. So you don't have to mess with, math.random or anything like that. Mongo handles the randomization. So it's kind of simple all the way down. And what this does is it creates 2 custom endpoints that are now part of this Loopback API. And I added this here, which helps Loopback create the OpenAPI description for these endpoints. So if you notice, it looks a little bit like the OpenAPI snippet that I showed you earlier, in that you've got a path and a verb and a method here that gets translated into the interactive documentation. So let me show you what that looks like. There we go. So I'm going to go ahead and quit. If I were running Node daemon or another kind of background checker helper right now, it would have picked up those changes automatically. But let's run this again. And let's go back to our Explorer and refresh here. Try not to click too fast. Oh, do you know what I didn't do? This is the other thing that's really tricky when using Loopback. Yeah, I didn't save it. It's hard for it to get changes that haven't been saved. Try one more time. Hey, and there's our random endpoint. And let's see if we get a question that's not about Copernicus. And we do. We get a question about Animal Planet. And now, if we hit this button as many times as we want, we will always get a different question for 218,000 times. Well, it'll probably give you a duplicate sometime. So, that's how you customize Loopback. And then the last thing that we're going to show today is exporting that Swagger definition that is automatically created. So, in order to do that, you just export it. There is a bug here. I've told them about it. They're going to fix it in the next version, but it is a bug. And one of the other great things about a developer advocate is when you find bugs, you get to be like, yep, it's a bug. Because you know, I didn't write this. This is not my fault. But, so you can see it hangs for a long time. And if it hangs too long, just go ahead and Control-C it. It writes the file immediately, like milliseconds, but it takes a long time for it to happen. And if you're as impatient as I am, it feels like an eternity. So, but now let's see. Hey, now we have our YAML file. And it looks like a Swagger file. And that's all set. And so now that you have the Swagger file, you can do cool stuff with it with Postman. So we're just going to switch machines here real fast. And Joyce from Postman. How many of you already use Postman? Awesome. Yeah, everyone else, definitely. I use it every day. And it always kind of saves my bacon.
How many people that use Postman have used it for testing before? Written a test? Couple? Okay.
Oh, they say please do not move podium. It's in big letters right here. You're such a rule breaker.
I am a rule breaker. Trust me, it will work. I did
Okay.
It just didn't want to disconnect on this one, so that's fine.
Okay.
Yeah, we should be okay.
All right, well, it's on you,
It's on me.
Juanita.
If I have to type over my shoulder, I might have to move the podium.
Okay.
Exactly.
Well, Juanita's already shown us it can be done. No
It can
siren
be
went
done.
off.
There's no siren whatsoever.
Nobody's come running through that door to say, my God, what have you done?
You should be okay now. Okay, perfect. Good.
All right, now you got a screen. Let me just get set up real quick.
Right, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Am I sharing my screen?
Hello, everyone. everyone. I'm Joyce. I'm from Postman. I do have stickers too, if anybody wants stickers after this. So I'm going to be talking about testing the API that Erin just built. So if you're not familiar with Postman already, we call it an API development environment, or an ADE. So there's a lot of things you can do with it, but something that people have in their mind when they think of Postman is testing and writing tests. So we will be focused on the testing part. Our workflow is going to be importing that Swagger file that Erin just exported from Loopback. If you didn't have an existing file that described your API already, you can build it from scratch inside Postman as well. But this is going to save us a lot of time for this demo. We're going to write a few tests, create a simple workflow, and then if you want to do that manually every time you're developing, that's fine. But if you deploy something in a production, I'll also show you how to monitor the APIs in production, in staging, in whatever environment you want. So programmatically running those tests instead of hitting run test every time. So is that super small? Tell me when you can read it. Okay, awesome. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start by importing that YAML file that we just exported from Loopback. So if you have Postman on your computer right now, you can go ahead and follow along and poke around and look at some of the same features, but otherwise you can follow along up here as well. So I'm going to go to the upper left corner, I'm going to click import, and you can see that I'm able to import in a few different files. A lot of the questions people ask are like, oh, I use Swagger, I use RAML, I use whatever. How does Postman work with it? And this is one way to ad hoc kind of work with it in a collection. So I'm going to go ahead and import the file. I have this file here, this Jeopardy API. And it says collection Jeopardy Mongo has been imported, so I'm going to look for right here. I'm going to start and bring it to the top here. So when I click on Jeopardy Mongo, this is a Postman collection. So my workspace, I'm moving off of the left-hand sidebar here. And if I open up this folder called Jeopardy Questions, I see all those endpoints that we just created in Loopback. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to create a test. So right now, all the questions, or all the endpoints were created and funneled under a folder called Jeopardy Questions. I'm going to go ahead and create a new folder. So I'm clicking the details and clicking Add Folder, and I'm going to call this Jeopardy Tests. Create. And now I see it down below, and I'm going to, I think some of this is a huge data set, so I'm going to pick the gets one random question. So I'm going to go ahead and click next to it and duplicate, creating a copy, and I'm going to go ahead and drag that into the new folder I just created. So I'm going to collapse this so you can see it. So when I click gets one random question copy, call it test. On the right-hand side, I can see the request that I'm about to send. So you can see the method, you can see the URL, and if there was any kind of metadata in here, you would see that here as well. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create, as Erin just mentioned, keeping our secrets secret. I'm going to go ahead and create an environment. So how many people have worked with environments in Postman before? Yes. Okay. So I'm going to go to the upper right corner and hit Manage Environments and say Add, and I'm going to call this Jeopardy, and I'm going to create an environment called root URL. So one reason why we work with environments is to keep our secrets secret, our credentials, our auth tokens, and all that kind of stuff hidden. But another reason is if you're switching back and forth between different server environments, staging, local hosts, that kind of thing, you can create a different environment with all those credentials in there and then just switch back and forth with the same collection. So in this case, I'm going to create something called Jeopardy Production. Okay. And we're going to variabilize an element of the URL, creatively called root URL. And we're going to go ahead, if I had that copy-paste productivity tool, I would use that there, but we'll go ahead and manually type in the publicly deployed endpoints. So I believe these have been deployed using IBM Cloud, so it lives somewhere for real, this data set. So I'm creating this key and value called root URL. I'm going to add it. Go ahead and select that environment Jeopardy prod that we just created. And I'm going to cut out the root URL here and use that double curly brace syntax. And so if I hover over it, I can see it's just string substitution. I'm just swapping out what would have been localhost, what would have been stage dot something for my production root URL. So when I go ahead and hit send, there's no method to handle get API. Oh, because I anyone know what I did wrong? So let's take a look at what we copied and pasted into our root URL. It's /API, so I should have deleted this part, starting with a slash. Let's try it again. Let's hit save. So this is retrieving a random question, and thankfully it's not Copernicus. This one actually works. This is Oprah. I am terrible at trivia, so I'm not going to even focus on reading that. Okay, so what we've done is we've created one request in a folder. And let's go ahead and write our first test. So you have the pre-request script and the test tabs here in the request builder. These are areas where you can write Postman, you can play around in the Postman sandbox. So you can write vanilla JavaScript. If you're familiar with chai testing syntax, you can write chai tests in here. So what I'm going to do here is I can either write vanilla JavaScript, or if I go to the right-hand section here under the snippets, especially if you don't write JavaScript frequently, you can go ahead and say, I'm going to go ahead and go to the Tests tab. And the pre-request will run before your request runs, and the test will run after your request runs. So in a test, what you can do is once you get that response, you can go ahead and inspect that response and make sure you're getting what you wanted. So on the snippets, I'm going to say, let's make sure we got a successful status code. So here's a little snippet here. This is going to append this pre-canned test that says PM test, status code is 200. If the response has a status code of 200, then this test called status code is 200 will pass. So I'm going to go ahead and, it's a little bit smaller, go ahead and send this again. And on the bottom, I'm going to be looking for my response. And we see that one test is run, and it's called status code is 200, and it has passed. So something that came out, I think, less than a month ago is collection level and folder level scripts. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say every single thing that runs in this folder, I want to test it and make sure it has a successful response code. I'm going to cut this test out of here. This test previously would have run only after this specific request. I'm going to go ahead and go to my Jeopardy tests folder, and I'm going to edit the folder details. And what this is here, pre-request scripts and tests for all requests in this folder, or if you did it at the collection level, for all requests in that collection. So I'm going to go ahead and paste this. Same, did it return a 200 response code under test and update. And now when I run this folder or this collection, this test will run after every single request in this folder. Okay? So, okay, good status code, that's good. Let's create a simple workflow. So, looking at some of these other questions, I think there is a simple question that says, does this exist? I think it's this one. So I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this, create a copy, and drag this into my Jeopardy tests folder. So when I click on it, this one checks whether a model instance exists, and it takes an ID. So I'm going to go ahead and variabilize this again. And what I have to do is save it. And we have a path here, :ID, and how do we, let's take a look at the previous response from the first question. looking at the response body, I see that I have underscore ID, and that's what I want to pass through to the next. So what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to extract data from the first request, save it somehow, and then inject it into my subsequent request. So I'm going to, does anybody know how to do that? We kind of already did it. So I'm going to go ahead and write a test, not so much a test, but I'm going to write something in the test scripts area, something that will execute after my request sends, and I'm going to capture that response. So I'm going to go ahead and create a variable called, random ID, or rando ID, and I'm going to parse the response. So Postman, you can use this in the sandbox, in the pre-request script or the test script section, has an API called the PM API. So it's like a PM dot wildcard anything, kind of like a Chrome API or something like that. So I'm going to parse a response by saying PM.response, and I know that the format's JSON. I'm going to turn it into JSON, and then I'm going to just click this little view changer in the bottom to go side by side. So now I'm looking directly at the request that I previously sent and received, and I see my JSON object would be digging down into questions, which then leads to an array. So I'm going to go ahead and take the first one in the array and access the underscore ID. So hopefully what I've done is create a variable called rando ID, a local variable called rando ID, that has the value here. And then what I want to do is I want to save it to an environment variable. So if I go ahead and look at my snippets, I see a snippet that says set an environment variable that will append this to the bottom of my script section. So it says PM, that same PM API, PM.environment.set. That means I'm setting an environment variable. So the first element here will be a string. What do I want to call this environment variable? I'm going to call it random ID, just spelled slightly different so we can tell that it's two different elements. And the value that I want to poke in there is this local variable called rando ID. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and go switch the pane view back to up down. Okay, so what I've done here is when I send this request, I'm going to parse the Postman response, and then I'm going to stuff it into an environment variable. So let's use this quick look view right up here, and you can see that the only variable that we have saved to our environment right now is the root URL. So now when I go ahead and send this request, nothing really happened. I got a new response, but when I looked at the quick look, I'll see that my environment, my local environment is now saving this value. Great. So in the next subsequent request within this folder, how do we use this variable? So right now we have this ID placeholder from Loopback, but let's go ahead and use our double curly braces. And what did we call it? We called it, I think, random ID. Yep. This is the one. So not really sure why this one is red, but let's go ahead and send it and see if it resolves itself. So I'll go ahead and hit save. And again, I'm looking at the quick look. We have this random ID variable that is saved in our local environment, and we are going to stuff it here and see if this question exists. Okay, could not get a response. So I believe, honestly, this might be an issue with copy and paste, but I'm going to go ahead and hard code this back in here. Unless somebody can catch my typo while I'm clicking around. No, too fast. Okay, so indeed this question does exist. So all I did was get a random question in the first request, and then save that ID, and then be like, does this really exist? So this is a very simple workflow, but you can write vanilla JavaScript. You can say, you can have a different folder that has tests for a logged in user. Say you have an e-com site. You can have an unhappy path scenario. If, is this data the data format that I was expecting? Does it contain these keys? Anything your world imagines in JavaScript. Okay, so how do we run this? So I've been running everything as kind of stepping through with breakpoints, But if we want to go ahead and run it, if we click Runner, and there's a few different ways to run your collection or run your folder, but in the app, the collection runner would be the best way to do it while you're developing and debugging. So it opened up a new window, and we're gonna, what's this one called? I think it's Jeopardy Mongo, potentially, and I think we were running Jeopardy tests. So I selected, I can either run the entire collection as a whole, or I can run folders, and then I'm going to select the corresponding environment that is going to be saving these variables that I'm using to pass along my values. Called it Jeopardy Prod, and I'm going to go ahead and run Jeopardy tests. So in the collection runner, you see all the tests that we have, and remember, we created one very simple status code test, but we're running it after every single request runs in that folder. So let's go ahead and add a second test, because status code is 200 is great, but let's see what else we could do. So under the second question, under tests, I'm going to go ahead and write a test. So that same Postman API has takes two parameters. The first one would be whatever I want to call my test. So the first one that we wrote was status code is equal to 200. So something that makes sense to you, because when you spit it back and you see a failing test, you'll want to see like what is failing. We're going to say question exists is what we want to call it. The second parameter is going to be a function, and what I'm going to be doing is essentially making sure that the question exists. So if I go back to this, I can see that this is the expected response if the question exists. An object that says exists equals true. So I'm going to go ahead and parse this data, again using the Postman response, turning it to JSON. And then we're going to use the chai syntax. Does anyone familiar with that? It's very readable, and I love consuming it, but writing it, it's like a little shaky at first, but good documentation, they have it. So I'm going to say PM expect, and JSON data is going to be the entire response that I just parsed. So I'm going to say dot exists. This should be equal to true. So you can see what I mean by it's pretty human readable, but like, where do I put the dots? Okay. So we'll go ahead and save this, and rather than running it as a individual request, I'm going to go ahead and click Runner, open the collection runner again. Select the folder that I want to run, select the environment that I want to run it against, and run Jeopardy tests. And so now you can see the first question we had was that default folder test, status code is 200. The second one had the same test, but then now we have a separate one. So you can write as precise of tests as you want, and in fact you should be checking whether or not something's live and running, but also is it returning the correct format, the correct data. Okay, so let's go ahead and go back to So to recap, we were able to import a file in that really gave us a jump start, but you can also create your collection from scratch. We can write tests as intricate or as broad as you want it to be, and then you can run it in the collection runner. And that's great for development and debugging, but say you wanted to run something programmatically, and you want to black box test something. Every 5 minutes, are my endpoints returning the responses that they should be running? You can either, has anyone used Newman, the command line tool? So a lot of DevOps people and a lot of QA people will use Newman. It's a CLI tool, npm it, install it, and then you would essentially download the collection locally, the environment locally if you want to run it against a corresponding environment. So if you want to go ahead and export those, you can export into whatever format you want for Postman. And then for environments, you would go ahead and download it and export that as JSON. So now if you have a local collection JSON file and a local environment JSON file, you would essentially download Newman and say Newman run this collection against this environment. And so you can see if you just create like a bash script, you can run this with whatever time you want, with whatever with whatever integration you have with your CI/CD pipeline. So you can do it with Newman, and you can also do it with a Postman monitor. So if you have a bash script running and you want to host this process, that's great, but Postman can also run it with you. All a Postman monitor is a scheduled run of your collection, and then you get notifications, and I'll go ahead and show you what that looks like really quickly. And monitors are relatively new as well. So if I go ahead and click Monitor Collection in the app, you can also do this from the web view. You'll go ahead and say Jeopardy monitor name of the collection, the environment, and then you can schedule it. So I think you can run it as often as every 5 minutes, and people do to run this and then connect it to their status page. And then there's also multi-region. So if you have clients in a certain region and you want to run it there, you can run it, but just be aware that the side effects are real. So if you run it in every region, you're going to run it in every region. And then you would go ahead and monitor this collection. So I believe I have a view of what that looks like. So I have a few monitors running. And in this case, this example of a monitor was running daily, and we had a couple failures, and you can dig into the logs and see what that looks like. So we created an endpoint, an entire thorough set of APIs, deployed it using IBM Cloud, and now we've tested it using Postman. Thank you.
So basically our goal is to make it as easy as possible for you to get your jobs done and to have nice, well-tested APIs that everyone who works with. Testing, you know, you haven't, your coding's not done until your tests all pass, is basically what I think. And but I love writing tests, and I would write tests all day long if I could. And let me find the right connector. So I just have a couple more slides, basically resource slides, to give you some links to find out more about OpenAPI. I think I only called it Swagger once or twice, right? They've changed the name to OpenAPI, and it's very hard for me to remember that that is, in fact, its new name. I really wanted them to call it Okapi. Does everybody know what an Okapi is? It's an animal that looks like, it's a donkey with a zebra butt, basically. Like it's a horse-looking animal, and just the back half looks like a zebra. And I think anyone who's done software development has built something where the front half looks like one thing and the back half looks like something else. So I thought it was a really good metaphor for building APIs. And then also the name Okapi is spelled O-K-A-P-I. But nobody listened to me when I said that. So let me see if I can get my slides back with just a couple more. Oh, there we go. So we survived the live coding, which is always good. And so there are lots of other things you can do to expand Loopback. We did a couple of those things. All the documentation for Loopback is at loopback.io. There's a Google group for Loopback that's pretty active. There's a Stack Overflow tag. Oh, and I forgot to change this link, but now it's called IBM Code. But actually, I think all of the Loopback stuff is still at that particular link. Has everybody who wanted to cell phone picture that, has cell phone pictured that? The endpoint that Joyce was testing is actually running now on IBM Cloud, and you, yes, you can get your own free IBM Cloud account that now lasts forever and has like a whole bunch of light services on it. Not every service is free, but you can get started and you can play with it for a really long time with that link. And if you do sign up, please use that link, because that's how they track whether people have actually come to these things.
Can you go back to the previous?
Yeah, so everybody's got their picture. Let's go back to this one. There's a lot of cool stuff that you can do with code patterns at IBM Code. So if you woke up this morning and said, you know, what I really want to do with the rest of my life is build Hyperledger applications, like you can definitely go there and get started. And there's a link to find out about all the stuff that's going on with the SF City team, and that extends all the way down the peninsula to San Jose, so there's stuff happening all over. And everybody taking a shot of this one that needs it. So, Open API resources. OpenAPIs.org is kind of the overall, overarching link that you can visit here. The spec is, of course, online on GitHub. If you are interested in contributing to the Open API specification, the team that works on it are super nice, very welcoming. There's a technical call every Friday morning. And you don't have to be super technical to participate in the technical discussion, because a lot of it is like, hey, does this make sense? And the more people who are on the call who can say, oh yeah, that makes sense to me, the more confident the spec writers are that they're actually building something that works for a wide range of developers. Swagger.io has a really nice online editor, so you can write your OpenAPI description there. And if you have questions for me, hit me up on Twitter. I also have open virtual office hours at that link, so a couple hours a month. You could just get on a screen share with me and ask me questions, because remember, I like answering questions. And if nobody comes, I will be sad and probably spend that time reading Twitter, which is bad for everybody. So, whoops, I think that's it. So, if folks have questions or just need another helping of food, we'll be here for a little while more, but thanks so much for coming. Oh, and stickers. Joyce has Postman stickers, which are really cool. They have like little astronauts on them. And I have some API Connect and Loopback stickers, and I also have a couple Semicolon Appreciation Society stickers if you want to join the Semicolon Appreciation Society. So, no salesman will call.